October 27, 1962, is considered by most historians to be the single most dangerous day of the Cold War. You probably know about the missiles in Cuba. You probably know about Kennedy and Khrushchev. What almost nobody knows is what was happening underwater. 60 meters below the Caribbean Sea, a Soviet submarine called the B-59 had been hiding for days. The air conditioning had failed. Temperatures inside had reached 60 degrees Celsius. In the engine room, it was higher, close to 65. Carbon dioxide was building up. Men were passing out at their posts. They had lost contact with Moscow. They had no idea what was happening on the surface. Then the explosions started. The American destroyers above were dropping signaling depth charges, small training explosives designed to force the submarine to surface for identification. They were not attacking. But inside the B-59, with no communication and no context, the crew had no way of knowing that. What the Americans also did not know, what they would not find out for 40 years, was that the B-59 was carrying a nuclear torpedo, a single weapon with the destructive power of the Hiroshima bomb, and the men inside believed they were already at war. This was not Vasili Arkhipov's first encounter with nuclear disaster. A year earlier, he had served aboard the submarine K-19 when a reactor coolant leak threatened a catastrophic meltdown. He helped prevent it. He was exposed to dangerous levels of radiation in the process. 7 engineers who worked on the reactor died within a month. 15 more died within 2 years. Arkhipov survived, but carried the radiation with him. Now he was chief of staff of the 69th Submarine Brigade, aboard the B-59 as its executive officer. He had been at sea since October 1st, when the 4 submarines left the Kola Bay in secret, 30 minutes apart, heading for Cuba. The mission was called Operation Anadir. Nobody was supposed to know about it. Within days, a French radio station was already reporting that Soviet submarines had entered the Atlantic. The submarines were built for Arctic conditions. The Caribbean was not the Arctic. The ventilation systems were never designed for tropical heat. As they moved further south, the temperatures climbed and the equipment began to fail. The diesel cooling system on the B-59 was contaminated with salt water. The electric air compressors broke down, the packing glands were leaking. The crew had no experience maintaining machinery under these conditions and no way to fix the problems properly while running silent. When Kennedy announced the blockade on October 22nd, the crew of the B-59 heard it on American civilian radio. That was how they found out the world was in crisis. They were listening to Kennedy warn America about the possibility of thermonuclear war through a consumer radio receiver in a leaking submarine in the middle of the Atlantic. After that, to avoid American anti-submarine patrols, they had to dive too deep to receive any radio signal at all. The news stopped. Moscow stopped. The outside world went silent. For days they moved through the dark, not knowing if the war had started without them. Captain Valentin Savitsky had had enough. Exhausted, overheated, convinced that war had begun, he ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared for launch. The political officer Ivan Maslenikov agreed. On most Soviet submarines armed with nuclear torpedoes, those 2 signatures were enough to fire. But the B-59 was different. Because Arkhipov was chief of staff of the entire brigade, not just the B-59, his signature was also required. By an administrative quirk of command structure, the fate of the world had been handed to a man who had already survived 1 nuclear disaster and knew exactly what he was being asked to unleash. Arkhipov said no. He argued that the explosions were signaling charges, not an attack, that no orders had come from Moscow. That surfacing was the right move. Savitsky reportedly shouted that they would sink every ship above them and die with their honor intact. Arkhipov did not yield. Eventually, and nobody recorded exactly how long this argument lasted or exactly what was said, Savitsky agreed to surface. The B-59 rose through 60 meters of Caribbean water into the blinding light of 11 American destroyers. The torpedo stayed in its tube. The submarine surfaced into chaos. American aircraft immediately flew over the conning tower at between 20 and 30 meters, turning on powerful searchlights. They fired warning shots from automatic cannons, more than 300 shells, past and along the boat. Destroyers cut across the submarine's path at dangerously close distances. Guns were trained on the hull, voices shouted from loudspeakers ordering the crew to stop engines. Arkhipov later described it as overwhelming. The crew stood on the bridge, blinking in the searchlights, disoriented after days in the dark, not entirely sure they had made the right decision. But the Americans did not board the submarine. They did not search it. They had no idea it was carrying a nuclear weapon. They would not find this out for another 40 years, when the Soviet archives were opened. Robert McNamara, Kennedy's defense secretary, said in 2002 that he had not known nuclear torpedoes were aboard. Had he known, he said, the entire situation would have been handled very differently. The B-59 was ordered back to the Soviet Union. When it arrived, the reception was not warm. Marshal Grechko, the acting defense minister, reportedly smashed his glasses on the desk when he heard the submarine had surfaced and revealed itself. He told the crew it would have been better if they had gone down with their ship. The men who had come within one argument of starting a nuclear war were considered an embarrassment. Arkhipov continued his naval career. He was promoted to vice admiral in 1981. He retired in the late 1980s. He lived quietly near Moscow with his wife Olga. He rarely spoke about October 27, 1962. Olga later said he felt their ordeal had never been properly understood or appreciated. Nobody outside the submarine community knew his name. Nobody in the Soviet Union recognized what he had done. In 1998, he died of kidney cancer. The illness was almost certainly caused by his radiation exposure on the K-19 37 years earlier. The same incident that shaped his reputation and gave him the authority to say no in 1962 was the thing that killed him in 1998. He was 72 years old. The engineers who died on the K-19 were gone within a month of the accident. Arkhipov lived long enough to save the world and then died quietly of the same cause, decades later, with almost nobody aware of either fact. In 2002, 40 years after the event, the Cuban Missile Crisis Anniversary Conference in Havana finally brought the story of the B-59 into public view. Thomas Blanton of the U.S. National Security Archive called Arkhipov the man who saved the world. Robert McNamara said they had come far closer to nuclear war than anyone had realized at the time. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who had been an advisor to Kennedy, called it the most dangerous moment in human history. More dangerous than anyone on the American side knew while it was happening. In 2017, Arkhipov was posthumously awarded the first Future of Life Award, given to people who have taken exceptional measures to protect humanity's future without obvious reward. His wife Olga accepted it on his behalf. The citation noted that he had saved the world and that nobody had known about it for 40 years. Here is what makes this story different from most history. The men at the top, Kennedy, Khrushchev, the generals and the diplomats, were negotiating in Washington and Moscow, fully aware of the stakes, surrounded by advisors, with access to every piece of intelligence available. And they almost failed anyway. What actually prevented nuclear war on October 27, 1962, was not a decision made in a government building. It was an argument in a sweltering submarine between three exhausted men who had lost contact with the world and had no idea what was happening above them. One of them said no. That was enough. One argument, one refusal, 60 meters below the Caribbean Sea. That is all that stood between October